At the courthouse, I stood alone without a lawyer, while my son tried to take the home I built for decades. His attorney smiled and my son whispered, "You're too old to decide what happens next." I stayed silent, holding my documents tightly and refusing to surrender. Then the judge looked at me and asked, "You don't remember me, do you?" I froze in confusion, unaware that one unexpected moment would change everything I thought I knew about my family. Thank you for joining Dad's Revenge Stories. Your support means the world to me. Tell me in the comments which country or city are you watching from. Please note, this narrative contains dramatized elements created for reflection and entertainment. Resemblances to actual people or locations are coincidental, yet the core takeaway is meant to inspire you. The courtroom was cold, the way only government buildings can be cold. Not just the air, but the walls, the floors, the long wooden benches that creaked when you shifted your weight. I sat at the defendant's table without a lawyer. My folder rested on the surface in front of me, thick with documents I had gathered myself over the past 3 months. Bank records, property tax bills, medical files, old receipts with my handwriting across the top. Across the aisle, my son Derek sat beside his attorney, a polished man in a charcoal suit who had probably never lost a case in his life. Derek did not look at me. His wife Sabrina sat one row behind him, her posture perfect, her expression composed like a woman attending a business meeting. She already knew the outcome of. The attorney smiled at me once, not a warm smile. The kind of smile that said he had already counted the money. Then the judge entered, and everyone stood. Her name was Patricia Holman. She was a woman in her mid-60s with silver hair pulled back at the neck and reading glasses she wore low on her nose. She settled into her chair, opened the file in front of her, and began reviewing the documents without speaking. The courtroom held its breath. Then she looked up. She looked directly at me, and something shifted in her face, the way a person's expression changes when they see something they recognize but cannot immediately place. She removed her glasses slowly. "You don't remember me, do you?" she said. My throat tightened. I had no idea what she meant. I had never seen this woman outside of a courtroom in my life, but I would not understand what she meant for another hour. And by the time I did, everything in that room had already changed. I planted that tree in the spring of 1983, the year Derek was born. It was taller than the house now. Its roots had pushed up one corner of the front walkway, and I kept meaning to fix it, kept telling myself, next weekend, next month, next spring. I heard the car before I saw it. A silver SUV pulled into the driveway, and Derek stepped out first. He was 44 years old and wore the kind of casual clothes that cost more than they looked. Sabrina came around from the passenger side, pulling her coat tight against the March air. They both had luggage, not overnight bags. Real luggage, the kind you pack when you are not planning to leave quickly. "Dad," Derek said, and he smiled the smile I had known since he was 8 years old, the one that meant he wanted something and had already prepared his argument. I told them to come inside. Sabrina moved through the kitchen, immediately opening cabinets, running her fingers along the counter edge. I noticed, but said nothing. I set 2 more mugs on the table and poured the coffee. Derek sat down across from me and folded his hands the way he always did when he was about to say something he had rehearsed. "We've been thinking about you a lot lately, Dad," he said. "About how things are here. The house, the yard, it's a lot for one person." "I manage," I said. "You do," he agreed quickly. "You always have. But Sabrina and I have been talking, and we think we really believe that it might be time for a different arrangement." He paused, giving the words room to land. "There's a place in Roseville," Sabrina said, her voice smooth and careful. "A senior living community. Independent living, not assisted. Beautiful grounds, social activities, everything taken care of. We toured it last month. I looked at my son. Last month. We wanted to have a real plan before we brought it up. And the house, I asked. Derek leaned forward slightly. The house is a significant asset, Dad. It makes sense for it to be managed properly going forward. For the family. I set my mug down on the table. Outside, the oak tree moved in the wind, its bare March branches scraping the gray sky. This house, I said, is where your mother died. No one spoke for a moment. I know that, Dad. It is where I brought her home from the hospital because she wanted to be home. It is where she asked me to keep her blue coffee mug on the second shelf because she said the light hit it right in the morning. It is where I have lived for 41 years. Derek's jaw tightened. We're not asking you to forget any of that. Then what are you asking? He was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then the rehearsed version of my son disappeared, and something harder took its place. We're asking you to be reasonable, he said. You're 72 years old. This property is worth close to $2 million. Keeping it sitting here while you rattle around alone inside it doesn't make sense for anyone. It makes sense for me. Derek pushed back from the table. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the yard. When he turned around, his voice was different. Dad, if you won't do this voluntarily, we're going to have to look at other options, legal options. The words landed quietly, but they landed. I looked at my son standing in the kitchen I had built in front of the window I had framed with my own hands in the house where his mother had taught him to read at that very table. I looked at him, and I tried to find the 8-year-old boy who used to run across the yard in his socks, tried to find the young man who had cried at his mother's funeral with his whole body shaking. I found neither one. Then I suppose, I said, we will let the legal options decide. That night I did not sleep. I sat in the kitchen long after Derek and Sabrina had gone upstairs to the guest room, my guest room in my house, and I listened to the building settle around me. Old houses do that. They breathe. The wood contracts in the cold, the floorboards shift, the window frames pop softly against the night air. I had heard those sounds for 41 years, and I knew every one of them the way you know the breathing of someone who sleeps beside you for decades. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug and let myself remember. I broke ground on this property in the spring of 1982. I was 30 years old, newly licensed as a civil engineer, and I had saved enough for the land, but almost nothing for the construction. So I did what my father had done, and his father before him. I built it myself. Every evening after work and every weekend for 3 years, I mixed concrete in a borrowed drum-framed walls with lumber I bought one load at a time and climbed onto the roof in the August heat to lay shingles while the Sacramento Valley shimmered below me. Helen brought lunch every Saturday without fail. She would park her blue Datsun at the curb, carry a paper bag across the dirt yard, and sit with me on whatever flat surface existed that week, a stack of plywood, a saw house, the open tailgate of my truck. She was pregnant with Derek by the second summer, her stomach round beneath her work shirt, and she never once complained about the dust or the noise or the fact that we were eating sandwiches on a construction site instead of at a proper table. It's going to be beautiful. She told me one afternoon in July of 1983, looking up at the half-framed structure with the afternoon light coming through the open walls. It's going to take another 2 years, I said. She handed me a sandwich. Then we'll be here another 2 years. Derek was born that October. We were still living in the apartment on Matherfield Road when he came home from the hospital. This red-faced, furious little person who screamed at 3 in the morning and fell asleep only when I held him against my chest and walked slow circles around the living room. Helen would watch from the doorway, exhausted and laughing quietly, and she would say, "He knows he's safe with you, Walter." He always knows. We moved into the house in 1985. Derek was 2 years old and walked bow-legged across the unfinished floors, patting the walls with his open palms. Helen stood in the kitchen and cried not from sadness, but from the particular relief of a woman who had believed in something long enough to finally see it standing. I remembered all of this sitting alone in that kitchen on a cold March night in 2024, and I felt the weight of it pressing against my sternum like a physical thing. In 1998, Derek had been 25 and working his first real estate job when a dispute with a business partner turned into a civil lawsuit. The other party claimed Derek had misrepresented terms of a property deal, and the damages being sought were enough to end his career before it began. Derek called me on a Thursday evening, his voice stripped of everything except raw fear. I sold my work truck the following Monday. It was a 1994 Ford F-250 that I had used for every project, every materials run, every job site visit for 11 years. The buyer paid $147,000. I transferred the funds to Derek's attorney that same afternoon. Derek called me when it was over. "Dad, I swear I will make it up to you someday," he said. "You don't owe me anything," I told him. "That's not how it works between a father and a son." I never mentioned the truck again. Helen knew she had watched me sign the transfer papers at the kitchen table, but she never brought it up either. That was how we were built, she and I. You did what the people you loved needed, and you did not keep a ledger. Helen died in November of 2018, 6 years before Derek came back with his luggage and his plans. Pancreatic cancer diagnosed in August, gone by November. 91 days from diagnosis to the last morning, I sat beside her bed in the room at the end of the hall and held her hand while the light came through the curtains. She asked me near the end to keep her blue coffee mug on the second shelf of the kitchen cabinet. "Hannah, the light hits it right in the morning," she said. "I want to know it's still catching the light." I kept the mug exactly there. Every morning I saw it. Every morning I said good morning to a woman who was no longer in the room, because some habits are not habits. They are the architecture of a life. And you do not tear down walls just because a room has gone quiet. I was still sitting at the kitchen table at 2 a.m. when I heard Sabrina's voice from the top of the stairs, low and careful, talking to Derek. I could not make out the words, but I heard Derek laugh, a short, confident sound, and then the floorboards creaked as they moved back to the bedroom. I stood up slowly. I walked to the kitchen cabinet and touched the blue mug on the second shelf. The ceramic was cool beneath my fingers. Then I saw it. On the kitchen counter, half tucked beneath Sabrina's handbag, a folded piece of paper. I pulled it free and opened it. It was a printout, a property listing, my address, my house. Estimated market value $1,850,000. At the bottom, handwritten in blue ink, Marcus W. confirmed deposit by Friday. My chest did not tighten. My hands did not shake. I folded the paper carefully, slid it into the front pocket of my shirt, and turned off the kitchen light. The next evening, Sabrina cooked. She moved through my kitchen the way she moved through everything, efficiently, purposefully, without asking where anything was kept, because she had already figured that out. The smell of garlic and rosemary filled the house by 5 o'clock. She had bought groceries that afternoon, expensive cuts from the butcher on Elk Grove Boulevard, a bottle of California Pinot Noir that she set on the counter with the label facing outward. She set the table with the good plates, Helen's plates, the cream-colored ones with the thin blue rim that we used only at Thanksgiving and Christmas. I watched all of this from the doorway and said nothing, because I had learned something the night before. The paper in my shirt pocket had taught me that silence for now was the sharper tool. Derek came downstairs in a fresh shirt, his hair combed, and clapped his hands together the way he did when he was performing cheerfulness. "Smells incredible in here," he said loud enough that I was supposed to feel included. We sat down. Sabrina served. The food was genuinely good. She had always been a strong cook, I will give her that. And for the first 20 minutes, we talked about nothing that mattered. The weather, a neighbor's new fence, a restaurant in Midtown Sacramento that Derek said we should try together sometime. I ate slowly and let them talk. Then Derek reached under his chair and brought up a cream-colored envelope. He set it on the table between us, centered carefully like a document being presented for signature. "We wanted to do something for you, Dad," he said. "Something real." I looked at the envelope but did not touch it. Sabrina leaned forward slightly. "It's a deposit confirmation. 6 months paid in full at Meadowbrook Senior Living in Roseville. Private suite, full amenities, a woodworking studio. We called ahead about that specifically because we knew you'd want it. They have a waiting list of over a year," Derek added. "We pulled some strings to get you in. It wasn't easy." I picked up the envelope and held it without opening it. I could feel both of them watching my hands. I set it back down on the table between Helen's cream-colored plates, beside the wine that neither of them had poured for me. "I'm not dead yet," I said. The table went quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then Sabrina's expression shifted, not dramatically, just a small tightening around the eyes, the adjustment of a woman recalculating. Derek's jaw moved. He picked up his wine glass, took a long sip, and set it down. "Nobody said anything about dying, Dad." Derek said, his voice careful now, stripped of the performance. "A man doesn't get moved out of his own home while he's still standing in it," I said. "Not in this family, not in any family I recognize." Derek's hand flattened on the table. "This is exactly the problem. You treat every conversation like an attack." "Is it not an attack?" He pushed back from the table. "We are trying to help you. You are trying to sell my house to a man named Marcus Webb for $1,850,000. I said it the way I would read a measurement off a blueprint level, precise, without emphasis. I found the listing sheet last night. It was under your wife's handbag." The color left Sabrina's face so completely that I could see the line where her foundation ended at her jaw. Derek did not move for a long moment. Then he turned to look at Sabrina, and whatever passed between them in that glance was not surprise. It was calculation. Two people deciding in real time how to respond to an obstacle they had not expected to surface this soon. "That was preliminary research," Sabrina said finally. "Nothing has been decided. The deposit note said confirm by Friday," I said. She opened her mouth, closed it. I stood up from the table, folded my napkin beside my plate the way Helen had always insisted on, and carried my dishes to the sink. Behind me I could hear Derek exhale a long, controlled breath and the scrape of his chair. "Dad, we should talk about this properly." "We just did," I said. I went to bed at 9 o'clock. I lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to their voices below, low, urgent, Sabrina's tone clipped and fast, Derek's slower and heavier. I could not make out words, only the rhythm of two people who had believed their plan was already finished, discovering that it was not. 4 days later, Derek called and asked if I would join them for lunch at a restaurant on Sunrise Boulevard. A neutral location, he said. Just the three of us, no pressure, no paperwork. I agreed because I wanted to see what the next move looked like. The restaurant was busy and bright. Sabrina sat across from me and kept the conversation easy. She had a gift for that, for filling a room with pleasant noise. At some point she asked me to repeat something because the music was loud, and I leaned forward and I noticed her phone propped against the centerpiece, angled toward me. The red recording light was on. I did not react. I took a sip of water. My right hand was resting on the table and I could feel a slight tremor in my fingers. Nothing unusual for a man my age after a difficult week. And I understood suddenly exactly what that recording was for. I understood what I must have looked like through that lens. An old man, tired hands unsteady, speaking slowly. I said very little for the rest of the lunch. I ate my food and smiled when it seemed appropriate and drove home alone. 2 days after that, my nephew Thomas called from Portland. He was Helen's sister's son, a good kid, 36 years old, and he sounded uncomfortable the way people sound when they are delivering a message they did not volunteer for. "Uncle Walter," he said carefully. "I saw the video in the family group chat. Is everything okay? Derek said you haven't been yourself." I gripped the phone. Outside, the oak tree stood solid against the afternoon sky. "Concrete," I said, "I am completely fine, but thank you for asking me directly." I called Frank Delano on a Tuesday morning, while Derek and Sabrina were still upstairs. Frank lived 4 houses down on Ridgewood Lane. We had been neighbors for 35 years, which meant we had shared fence lines, borrowed tools, attended each other's children's graduations, and stood beside each other at funerals more times than either of us cared to count. Frank was 69 years old, a retired carpenter with hands like mine, wide scarred across the knuckles, permanently stained with the ghost of old varnish. He had helped me hang the kitchen cabinets in this house back in 1986, and he still kept the level he had used that day hanging in his own garage like a memento. He answered on the second ring. "Walter," he said, and I could hear from the single word that he already knew something was wrong. "I need you to come over," I said. "Bring your reading glasses." He was at my door in 11 minutes. I let him in through the side entrance, the one that opened directly into the kitchen, away from the staircase. I spread the property listing sheet on the kitchen table beside the note with Marcus Webb's name on it. Frank sat down, put on his glasses, and read slowly. He was the kind of man who read things twice before he said anything, which was one of the reasons I had called him. When he finished, he took his glasses off and set them on the table. "How long has this been in the works?" he asked. "Long enough that Sabrina already has a buyer and a deposit," I said. "The listing shows professional photographs, interior and exterior. She would have needed access to every room." Frank turned the paper over as though something might be written on the back. "They took these while you were living here." "I was in the house," I said. "I must have been in the yard or the workshop. I never saw a photographer." Frank pressed his lips together and set the paper down flat. Outside, a car passed on Ridgewood Lane. A dog barked twice somewhere down the block. The kitchen held its breath around us. "Frank," I said, "what aren't you telling me?" He looked up. His eyes were steady, but something behind them shifted, the way a man's expression shifts when he has been holding a weight and finally decides to set it down. "Derek came to see me," he said, "about 2 months ago." I did not move. "He came on a Saturday afternoon, said he was in the neighborhood, stopped by for coffee. We talked about general things for a while, the Kings, the weather, my hip replacement." Frank paused. Then he got to the point. "What did he ask you?" Frank exhaled slowly through his nose. "He asked me if I would be willing to speak to someone on his behalf. A social worker or a court evaluator, he was not specific about which. He said he was concerned about you living alone. He wanted me to confirm that I had noticed you being forgetful, leaving things on, not managing the house properly." The refrigerator hummed. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. "And had you," I asked, "noticed any of that?" "No," Frank said flatly. "You are the most organized man I have ever known, Walter. You change your smoke detector batteries on the same weekend every October. You have a maintenance log for this house going back 20 years. He shook his head. "I told Derek I would not do it." "But you didn't tell me." Frank's jaw tightened. He looked down at his hands on the table. I didn't think he would actually go through with it. I thought it was frustration talking. A son venting about a stubborn father. He looked up. I was wrong, and I am sorry for that. I sat with that for a moment. The apology was genuine. I could hear it in the grain of his voice, the particular roughness of a man who does not apologize often and means it completely when he does. I was not angry at Frank. Frank had made a mistake in judgment, not in character. He said something else, Frank continued, before he left. Tell me. Frank reached into his shirt pocket and produced a small folded piece of paper. A page torn from the pocket notebook, covered in his careful carpenter's handwriting. He slid it across the table. I unfolded it and read. The words were a direct quote, dated and timed the way Frank noted everything. Derek Grayson, Saturday, February 3rd, approximately 2:45 in the afternoon. My father has been accommodating his whole life. He's never once stood his ground against me. He won't start now. I read it twice. Then I folded the paper and placed it beside the property listing. He was counting on me to step aside, I said. Yes, Frank said. He was. I stood up and carried both mugs to the sink. I rinsed them slowly, watching the water run over my hands. 42 years of work in these hands. 42 years of building and fixing and holding things together. I need a notary's records, I said, not turning around. For a document Derek's attorney may try to use in court. I need to know who handled it and whether their office was open on a specific date. Frank was quiet for a moment. You already know the answer, don't you? I turned off the tap. I think I do. But knowing and proving are two different things. Frank stood up from his chair and picked up his glasses from the table. He tucked them into his breast pocket and looked at me with the expression of a man who has just decided which side of a fence he is standing on. Tell me what you need, he said. Derek offered to drive me to my cardiology appointment that Thursday morning, and I let him. Not because I needed the ride. I had driven myself to every appointment for 6 years, and my reflexes were fine. I let him drive because I wanted to watch how he behaved when he believed he was being generous, the way he held the door, the way he asked the receptionist to let his father know he was in the waiting room, the way he bought 2 coffees from the hospital cafe and handed one to me with both hands like a man presenting an offering. He was performing a son, and he was doing it well. And I sat in the waiting room chair and drank my coffee and said very little. My cardiologist, Dr. Raymond Briggs, had been monitoring my heart for 11 years. He reviewed my latest blood work, checked my blood pressure, listened to my chest, and told me what he told me every 4 months, that I was managing well for a man my age, that I should keep walking 30 minutes a day, and that stress was the enemy of a stable heart. He said the last part, looking at me over his glasses in a way that suggested he sensed something I had not told him. Everything all right at home, Walter? He asked. Working through some things, I said. He nodded slowly and did not push further. That was one of the things I appreciated about Raymond Briggs. He understood the difference between a man who needed to talk and a man who needed to think. Derek drove me home along Elk Grove Boulevard, pointing out a new development going up near the Highway Exchange, talking about property values in Sacramento County, the way he always did, fluently, enthusiastically, like a man who could not look at land without calculating what it was worth. I listened and watched the familiar streets pass outside the window. We pulled into the driveway at 11:47 in the morning. I remember the time because I glanced at the dashboard clock and thought that Helen would have had lunch ready by now, would have been standing at the stove with the radio on low, some old country station she pretended not to like. I went inside through the front door. The smell hit me first. Paint. Fresh latex paint, sharp and chemical, cutting through the familiar smell of old wood and the faint cedar of the hallway closet. I stopped walking. Derek stepped in behind me and closed the door. "Dad, before you go upstairs," he started. I was already moving. The door to the bedroom at the end of the hall stood open. I stepped through it and stopped in the middle of the room and looked at what they had done. The walls were white. A clean, flat, institutional white, still faintly wet in the corners. The curtains Helen had chosen pale yellow cotton with small embroidered flowers at the hem were gone. The braided rug she had ordered from a catalog in 2009 was gone. The framed photograph of our wedding day that had hung on the wall above the dresser for 38 years was gone. The hook beside the closet door where Helen's blue cardigan had hung since the November she died empty. The floor was bare hardwood. The room smelled like a room that had been scrubbed of itself. Sabrina appeared in the doorway behind me. "We wanted to freshen the space while we had the opportunity," she said. Her voice was bright and careful. "Staying in a room that hasn't changed in 6 years, it isn't healthy, Dad. It keeps you from moving forward." I did not answer her. I walked to the corner of the room where the dresser had stood. There was a small rectangular depression in the hardwood floor where the dresser feet had rested for decades. I crouched down slowly, the way a 72-year-old man crouches, and pressed my fingers into that depression. The wood was darker, there protected from light and air for 40 years. Helen had stood in this exact spot every morning and brushed her hair. I had watched her do it 10,000 times. I stood back up and turned around. Derek was in the doorway now beside Sabrina. His arms crossed, his expression arranged into something that was trying to look like concern. "Where are her things?" I asked. "We boxed everything carefully," Sabrina said. "It's all in the garage. Nothing was thrown away." "Her cardigan." A pause. "In the boxes, Dad. Everything is labeled." I walked past both of them without another word. I went down the stairs, through the kitchen, and out the side door into the garage. The boxes were stacked against the far wall, 4 of them sealed with brown packing tape. On top of the highest box, someone had set Helen's blue cardigan in a folded square, as though that made it acceptable. I picked it up. The wool was still soft. It still held a shape, the particular shape of a woman's shoulders, worn into the fabric over years of wear. I pressed it flat against my chest with both hands and stood in the cold garage and breathed. Behind me, I heard the door open. "Dad," Derek began. "Do not come in here," I said. He did not. I stood there for a long time. The cardigan was the first thing I put back inside the house when I carried the boxes upstairs myself that afternoon, one at a time, each one heavier than the last. I hung the cardigan back on its hook. I rehung the wedding photograph. I put the braided rug back on the floor. When I finished, I sat on the edge of the bare mattress in the repainted room, and I felt something settle inside me, not peace exactly, but resolve. The particular resolve of a man who has finally understood what is actually at stake. This was not about a house. It had never been about a house. It was about whether the life Helen and I had built together was allowed to mean something after we were gone. I went to find my phone. I had a call to make. My phone died at 6:15 that evening. I had been sitting at the kitchen table going through property records when the screen went black. The charger was upstairs in the bedroom, and I did not want to walk past Derek and Sabrina, who were in the living room with the television on, talking in low voices that stopped whenever I moved through the house. I picked up Derek's phone from the kitchen counter where he had left it and carried it to the table. Derek was in the living room 12 feet away. I was not trying to read his messages. I pressed the home button to check the time, and the screen lit up on a conversation already open, a text thread between Derek and Sabrina, the most recent message sitting there fully visible before any lock screen appeared. I read it in 3 seconds. Once he signs, move fast. Don't give him time to change his mind. The lawyer said, just get it done. Marcus needs confirmation by end of week. I set the phone face down on the table. I placed both hands flat on the wood surface and looked at the grain of the oak, the same oak I had sourced from a mill in Stockton in 1984, cut and planed myself laid down over 3 weekends, with Frank helping me on the 2nd and 3rd. I had chosen this wood because Helen said she wanted floors that would last longer than either of us. She had been right. The floors were still perfect. Derek came into the kitchen 2 minutes later to refill his water glass. He picked up his phone from the table without looking at me. The screen had gone dark again. He did not know I had seen anything. "Dinner?" he asked, opening the refrigerator. "Not hungry," I said. He shrugged and went back to the living room. I sat at that table for another hour. I did not move. I did not write anything down. I simply sat with what I had read and let it settle into its proper place, alongside everything else I had learned in the past 2 weeks. The listing sheet, Frank's account of Derek's visit, the painted room, the clip recorded at the restaurant. And now this, the confirmation that speed was the strategy, that the plan depended on moving faster than I could think. The following morning, I tried to call Derek from my own phone, which I had charged overnight. The call connected to voicemail immediately. I tried again an hour later, voicemail again. I sent a text message asking him to call me when he had a moment. No response came. By the afternoon, I understood that this was not coincidence. I walked down Ridgewood Lane to the house of Pastor Roy Simmons. Roy was 71 years old and had led the congregation at Elk Grove Community Church for 22 years. He and Helen had been close. She had served on the hospitality committee for a decade, and he had presided over her funeral service. He had checked on me every month since she passed, arriving at my door with no announcement, staying for exactly 1 cup of coffee, asking questions and listening to the answers with the full attention of a man who had learned that listening was the most precise tool available to him. Roy answered his door in a flannel shirt and reading glasses. "Walter," he said, "come in." "I need a favor," I said. "A small one." I explained that I had been trying to reach Derek, but my calls were not connecting. I asked Roy if he would try calling Derek's number from his own phone while I stood there. Roy looked at me steadily for a moment, taking in the information behind the request the way he always did, and then picked up his phone from the side table and dialed. Derek answered on the 2nd ring. "Derek, it's Roy Simmons. Just checking in, son. How are you holding up?" I heard Derek's voice through the speaker, warm, easy, the performance version I recognized from the dinner table. Roy spoke with him for 2 minutes about nothing consequential, then ended the call and set the phone down. We looked at each other across the small living room. "He blocked my number," I said. "That's what it appears," Roy said carefully. I sat down in the chair across from him. Outside, the afternoon light was going gold through the window, the particular late April light that Helen had loved, that she said made Sacramento look like a painting nobody had thought to title yet. "Roy," I said, "how long does a man wait before he stops being patient and starts being foolish?" Roy took his glasses off and cleaned them with the hem of his flannel shirt, which was a habit he had when he was thinking seriously. Then he put them back on and looked at me. "I think you already know the answer to that, Walter," he said. "I think that's why you're sitting in my living room at 4 in the afternoon instead of at your kitchen table." He was right. I had already decided. I had decided in the garage with Helen's cardigan pressed against my chest, and I had decided again when I read that message on Derek's phone, and I had decided a third time sitting alone at my kitchen table while the oak floors held steady beneath me. I thanked Roy and walked home in the early evening. The oak tree in the front yard cast a long shadow across the walkway. I stepped over the raised root I kept meaning to fix and went inside. I sat down at the kitchen table and wrote 3 pages of notes in my old engineering notebook. Dates, names, amounts, sequences. Every fact I could verify. Every conversation I could document. Then I wrote Frank's name at the top of a fresh page and underlined it twice. I had been staying at the Comfort Inn on Laguna Boulevard for 11 days when Derek called. I had moved out the week before, not because anyone asked me to leave my own house, but because I could no longer eat breakfast in Helen's kitchen, while Sabrina reorganized the cabinets and Derek made phone calls in the next room that stopped the moment I walked through the door. I took one bag, my engineering notebook, the folder of documents I had been building, and Helen's blue coffee mug wrapped in a dish towel. The room at the Comfort Inn cost $89 a night and smelled like commercial carpet cleaner, but it had a small desk by the window where I could work, and nobody reorganized anything while I slept. Derek called the motel's front desk on a Wednesday morning because my cell number was still blocked. Frank had told me later that Derek had driven past the house, seen it dark for several nights, and called around to nearby motels until he found where I was staying. The woman at the front desk knocked on my door and told me my son was on the line. I went down to the lobby and picked up the receiver. "Dad," Derek said, "your birthday is Saturday. We want to do something. Come home for the afternoon, just family, some neighbors, nothing formal." I thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. "All right," I said. Frank picked me up Saturday morning, and we drove together. He wore his good flannel shirt and carried a small wrapped package under his arm. I wore the gray blazer Helen had bought me for our 35th wedding anniversary. Frank did not ask me why I had agreed to come. He understood the way old friends understand things without requiring explanation, that sometimes you walk into a room precisely because you need to see what happens inside it. The house looked the same from the outside. The oak tree, the front walkway, the porch light I had installed in 1986. Inside, about 20 people had gathered, neighbors, Derek's colleagues, 2 cousins from Helen's side of the family, who drove up from Fresno. Sabrina had decorated with yellow balloons and a banner across the mantelpiece. Someone had ordered a cake from the bakery on Grant Line Road, white frosting, blue lettering, "Happy 72nd, Dad." I shook hands and accepted embraces and said thank you more times than I could count. Frank stayed close, refilling his paper cup from the punch bowl, positioning himself within arm's reach of me throughout the afternoon. An hour into the party, Derek appeared at my elbow with a manila envelope. "Dad, I have a few papers I need you to look over," he said, keeping his voice low beneath the noise of the room. "Just administrative things related to the estate planning we discussed. Signatures confirming you've reviewed the documents, standard stuff." He held the envelope out. Around us, people laughed and talked and reached for cake. The room was warm and loud and full of the kind of comfortable noise that made careful attention difficult. I reached for the envelope. Frank's hand came down gently on my forearm. "Read every page before you sign anything, Walter," he said clearly. "Every single one." Derek looked at Frank. Something moved through his expression. Not anger exactly, but the particular frustration of a man who is prepared for every obstacle except the one now standing in front of him. I opened the envelope. There were 4 pages. The first 3 were genuinely routine, an acknowledgement of a prior conversation about estate planning, a form confirming my contact information. The 4th page was a durable power of attorney for property management, granting Derek full authority to make real estate decisions on my behalf, executable immediately upon signature. I read it twice. Then I placed all 4 pages back in the envelope, folded it once, and put it in the breast pocket of my gray blazer. "I'll have my attorney review these," I said. Derek's jaw tightened. "You don't have an attorney, Dad." "I will," I said. I went back to the party and ate a piece of cake, and talked with Helen's cousin Margaret about her garden in Fresno, and Derek did not approach me again for the rest of the afternoon. Frank stood beside me at the window when the guests began leaving, and neither of us said anything about what had happened, because there was nothing that needed saying. 3 days later, on a Tuesday evening, someone knocked at my motel room door. I opened it to find Carol Finch standing in the corridor. She was 75 years old, my neighbor from the house directly north of mine on Ridgewood Lane, a small woman with white hair and a cardigan buttoned to the collar. She had brought me tomatoes from her garden every August for 20 years and had cried openly at Helen's funeral. Her eyes were red now, too, and she was gripping her handbag with both hands, the way people grip things when they are preparing to say something difficult. "Walter," she said, "I have done something I should not have done, and I need to tell you about it." I opened the door wider and stepped aside. She came in and sat at the desk chair and told me everything. Sabrina had visited her 3 weeks earlier, bringing a plate of cookies and a form she described as a neighborhood quality of life petition. She said the HOA was compiling resident feedback and needed signatures from longtime homeowners. Carol had signed without reading carefully because Sabrina had sat across from her and smiled, and the cookies were very good, and it had all seemed entirely reasonable. She had learned the truth from her daughter in San Jose, who worked in property law, and had asked Carol what she had signed, and then gone very quiet on the phone. Carol's hands were shaking on her handbag. "It was about you, wasn't it? The form." "Yes," I said. Her chin dropped to her chest. "I am so sorry, Walter. Helen would be ashamed of me." "Helen would understand," I said. "And so do I." The mediation office was on the 14th floor of a building on Capitol Mall in downtown Sacramento, the kind of office that communicated seriousness through its furniture, long mahogany table leather chairs, a view of the city that cost more per square foot than most people's apartments. Derek's attorney, a man named Gerald Foss, was already seated when Frank and I arrived. Foss was in his mid-50s, silver-haired, with the relaxed posture of a man who spent most of his working hours in rooms exactly like this one. Derek sat beside him. Sabrina was not present, a choice, I noted, not an absence. Frank sat in the chair beside me. He was not my attorney. He was my witness, and Gerald Foss knew the difference and did not object, because objecting would have looked like the kind of thing you did when you had something to hide. Foss opened his leather portfolio and began speaking in the measured tone of a man presenting a reasonable offer. "Mr. Grayson, my client, has asked me to convey that this matter need not proceed to a formal hearing. The property at Ridgewood Lane represents a significant asset that, managed properly, could benefit the entire family. Derek is prepared to offer you a guaranteed monthly income from the proceeds of a sale enough to cover a private suite at any senior facility in Sacramento County, with funds remaining for personal expenses and medical care." I let him finish. Then I said, "No." Foss smiled patiently. "Perhaps if we discussed the specific figures—" "The figures don't matter," I said. "The house is not for sale." Derek leaned forward, his forearms on the mahogany table. He had worn a jacket and tie, which he rarely did, and it made him look like a version of himself that was trying too hard to be taken seriously. "Dad, your stubbornness is the only thing standing between our family and a stable future," he said. "Do you understand what that feels like from where I'm sitting?" I looked at my son across the long table. I thought about 1998. I thought about a Thursday evening phone call and a voice stripped of everything except fear. I thought about a Ford F-250 and a check for $147,000 and a promise he had made that someday he would make it up to me. I understand exactly what it feels like, I said. I felt something similar in 1998 when I sold my truck to keep you out of a courtroom. You were 25 years old and you were terrified. I did not ask you to be grateful. I did not ask you for anything. But I want you to sit in that chair and tell me honestly, do you remember that day? Derek's jaw moved. He looked at Gerald Foss, then back at me. That was a long time ago, he said. Yes, I said. It was. And this house was standing then too. Foss intervened smoothly. Mr. Grayson, perhaps we could refocus on the practical realities of the current situation. Maintaining a property of this size alone at your age presents genuine challenges. Courts in California take these factors seriously in conservatorship evaluations. Then let the court evaluate, I said. Foss placed a document on the table and slid it across to me. It was the same form Derek had tried to get me to sign at the birthday party, the power of attorney, with a new cover page and a line highlighted in yellow where my signature was expected. I did not touch it. Derek's voice dropped lower, the performance gone something rawer underneath. Dad, if you push this into a full hearing, it gets expensive and ugly for everyone. Is that really what you want? What I want, I said, is for my son to look me in the eye and explain how a man who loves his father prepares forged documents and sells a stranger the right to a house that does not belong to him. The room went completely still. Gerald Foss stopped writing. Derek's face did something complicated, a rapid sequence of expressions that moved through anger calculation and something that looked briefly like shame before settling into a careful blankness. I don't know what you think you've found, Derek said quietly. I know what I've found, I said. And so does Frank. Frank said nothing. He did not need to. He simply sat with his hands folded on the table and looked at Derek with the steady gaze of a man who had known a family for 35 years and was not impressed by what he was seeing. Derek pushed his chair back from the table. He stood up and buttoned his jacket and looked out at the Sacramento skyline for a long moment. When he turned back around, his voice was very quiet. If you take this further, Dad, whatever happens to me is on you. I stood up. I straightened my own jacket and picked up my folder from the table. Whatever happens to you, Derek, I said, has been entirely in your own hands from the beginning. Frank and I rode the elevator down in silence. On the ground floor, we walked out onto Capitol Mall and stood in the May afternoon sunlight. Pigeons moved across the plaza. A food truck was doing business near the corner. Sacramento went about its Tuesday the way cities do, indifferent to the small catastrophes unfolding inside its buildings. Frank looked at me. How are you holding up? I need to go back to the house, I said. There is something in the workshop I have not checked yet. Something Helen left. Frank nodded without asking what it was. That was the thing about old friends. They knew when to ask and when to simply walk beside you to the car. The hearing was scheduled for 9:30 on a Thursday morning at the Sacramento County Superior Court on Gordon D. Shaber Drive. I arrived at 8:55, wearing the same gray blazer I had worn to the birthday party, carrying my folder, and nothing else. No attorney sat beside me. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood paneling, fluorescent lighting, 3 rows of gallery benches behind the bar. It smelled like old paper and floor wax. Gerald Foss was already at the opposing table. His briefcase open, his exhibits arranged in neat stacks. Derek sat beside him in a dark suit. Sabrina occupied the first gallery row directly behind them. Her hands folded in her lap, Her posture, the same composed stillness she brought to every room she entered. Foss glanced at me once when I sat down. Then he looked at the empty chair beside me and allowed himself a small, private adjustment of expression that was not quite a smile, but carried the same meaning. I placed my folder on the table and opened it. The bailiff called the court to order. Everyone stood. Judge Patricia Holman entered from the side door and took her seat at the bench. I recognized her immediately from the first hearing, the same careful posture, the same unhurried way she settled into the chair before doing anything else. She opened the case file and read in silence for 40 seconds before she looked up. The courtroom held the particular silence of a room where everyone is waiting for someone else to speak first. Then she looked up. She looked directly at me, and something shifted in her face, not recognition immediately, but the particular hesitation of a mind locating something it did not expect to find. She removed her glasses slowly. "You don't remember me, do you?" she said. My throat tightened. I had never seen this woman outside of a photograph in a court directory. She said, "Route 50, October 2009. There was a storm. I knew Route 50. I knew October of 2009. I had driven that highway 1,000 times between Sacramento and South Lake Tahoe. And then something shifted inside my memory, not gradually, but all at once, the way a photograph develops in a darkroom detail appearing from nothing. The rain had been coming down so hard that my windshield wipers could not keep pace. I had been driving home from a structural assessment in El Dorado Hills when I saw the car, a gray sedan, spun across 2 lanes. Its front end collapsed against the concrete median barrier. Hazard lights flashing. No one else had stopped. I pulled over. The woman inside was conscious, but her door was jammed, and the frame had buckled around her. She was gripping the steering wheel with both hands, and her breath was coming in short, shallow bursts that I recognized as shock. I called 911, then crouched beside the broken window in the rain with water running down the back of my neck and my shirt soaked through in 40 seconds. "I'm not leaving," I told her. "Help is coming, and I am not leaving." I reached through the broken window and held her hand. We stayed like that for 35 minutes while the rain came down, and the emergency lights appeared in the distance. She told me her name. She told me she had a daughter in college. She told me she was afraid, and I told her that was all right, that being afraid was reasonable, and that she was doing fine. When the fire crew finally cut the door away and the paramedics moved in, she looked at me from the stretcher and said something I could not hear over the noise of the rain and the radio traffic. I raised a hand, and she raised hers, and then the ambulance doors closed. I had never seen her again. Until this moment. Judge Patricia Holman set her reading glasses down on the bench and addressed the courtroom. Before this proceeding continues, I am required to disclose a prior personal connection to the petitioner's father, Mr. Walter Grayson, arising from circumstances entirely unrelated to this case. Her voice was steady and formal and gave nothing away. Under California Code of Civil Procedure, Section 170.1, I am obligated to recuse myself from any matter in which a prior relationship with a party could reasonably be perceived to affect impartiality. Gerald Foss sat forward immediately. "Your Honor, if I may." "You may not, Mr. Foss." She did not raise her voice. "The recusal is not subject to objection by either party. It is a matter of judicial ethics, and it is not negotiable." She gathered the file and stood. Then she paused. She looked at me one final time across the courtroom. "The record in this matter contains irregularities that will require careful examination," she said. "I trust the court to which this case is reassigned will give them the attention they deserve." Then she walked through the side door, and the room exhaled around me. Derek turned in his chair and looked at me for the first time that morning. His expression was unreadable, not angry, not relieved. The expression of a man recalculating something he believed was already solved. Foss leaned toward Derek and spoke quietly. Derek shook his head once. I sat perfectly still with my folder open in front of me and my hands flat on the table. In the gallery behind me, I heard Sabrina shift in her seat. The bailiff announced that the hearing was continued pending reassignment to a new judge. Everyone stood. The room began to empty. I remained seated. In my shirt pocket, folded once, was a piece of paper on which I had written a single date, May 12th, 2022. Below it, 3 words in my engineer's handwriting: I was there. Frank knocked on my motel room door at 7:45 that evening. I had been sitting at the small desk by the window since 4 o'clock. My engineering notebook open in front of me, working through the timeline the way I used to work through load calculations on a building site, methodically, without rushing, checking each figure against the ones before and after it. When I heard the knock, I closed the notebook and opened the door. Frank stood in the corridor, holding a brown paper bag and a manila envelope that had been folded in half, and then unfolded again, as though he had picked it up and put it down several times, before finally deciding to bring it. He looked like a man who had driven to a destination he was not sure he should have come to. I brought sandwiches, he said. Come in, I said. We sat at the small table by the window, the Sacramento night pressing against the glass outside. Frank set the sandwiches between us and placed the envelope beside them, and did not touch either one for a moment. He looked out the window at the parking lot below, where the lights of Laguna Boulevard ran orange and steady in the dark. I should have come to you sooner, he said. You came when it counted, I said. Tell me what's in the envelope. Frank picked it up and opened it and spread 3 items on the table between us. The first was a page from his pocket notebook, the same kind he had used for 30 years on job sites, the narrow kind with a red cover that fit in a shirt pocket. The second was a printout of a text message photographed from his phone screen. The third was a hand-drawn timeline on a folded piece of graph paper. He pointed to the notebook page first. Chuttis. When Derek came to see me in February, I wrote down everything he said as soon as he left. Date, time, exact words where I could remember them. He tapped the page. He told me he was going to file for conservatorship. He told me he needed supporting statements from people who knew you. He said, and I wrote this word for word, that you had been, quote, accommodating your whole life, and that you would not stand your ground against him now. I read the entry. Frank's handwriting was the careful block printing of a man who had spent decades writing measurements on lumber. He believed it, I said. He believed it completely, Frank said. That was the thing that bothered me most. He was not nervous when he said it. He was confident, like he was describing a fact about the weather. Frank pointed to the text message printout next. 3 weeks after he came to see me, he sent me this. I read the photographed screen. The message was from Derek's number, time-stamped the 14th of March at 2:17 in the afternoon. Frank, hope you've had time to think over what we discussed. I'm moving forward with the filing next week. If you're willing to provide a statement, have it ready by the 21st. If not, no hard feelings. Either way, this gets resolved. He sent this to you, I said. Yes. And you did not respond. No, Frank said. I deleted it the same day. Then I took a screenshot first, which is why I still have it. I looked at Frank across the table. I did not think he would actually do it, Frank said. His voice carried the particular weight of a man who had been wrong about something that mattered. I have known Derek since he was a boy riding his bicycle down Ridgewood Lane. I watched him grow up. I told myself it was a bad patch, financial pressure, a difficult marriage, temporary thinking. He stopped. I was wrong. And sitting in that courtroom today, watching him not look at you, I understood how wrong I was. I moved the text message aside and looked at the graph paper timeline. Frank had drawn out a sequence of dates beginning in January of this year and running forward to the present. Each date had a brief notation beside it. I followed the sequence with my finger. It was precise and orderly, and it confirmed everything I had assembled in my own notebook, but with the addition of the February visit and the March text that I had not known about. "This is good work, Frank," I said. "It is carpenter work," he said. "Measure twice." I opened my own notebook and turned to the page where I had written May 12th, 2022. I slid it across the table. Frank read the date and looked up. "Your hospital stay?" he said. "I was unconscious for 18 hours, I said. "The document Derek submitted to the court, the transfer agreement with my signature, is dated that day. Signed at 2 in the afternoon, according to the notarization stamp." Frank sat with that for a moment. The parking lot lights reflected off the window glass. A truck moved through the intersection below. "Who notarized it?" he asked. I opened my folder and found the copy of the document from the court filing. I pointed to the stamp at the bottom of the final page. Frank read the name aloud. "Thomas Redfield, Notary Public, Sacramento County." "I need to find out whether his office was open on that date," I said, "and whether any transaction matching this description appears in his official journal." Frank reached into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt and produced a folded piece of paper. He set it on the table. "Thomas Redfield has an office on Watt Avenue," he said. "I looked him up this afternoon while I was waiting for you to get back from the courthouse. He is still licensed. His office number is on that paper." I picked it up. I looked at it for a moment. Then I looked at Frank. "You thought of this before I asked," I said. "I measured twice," he said. "The Legal Aid Society of Sacramento occupied the second floor of a building on 9th Street, 3 blocks from the courthouse. The waiting room had plastic chairs, a water dispenser, and a bulletin board covered with information about tenant rights and family law resources. I arrived when the office opened at 8:30 and sat with 11 other people until my name was called 40 minutes later. The attorney who came to get me from the waiting room was Margaret Osei. She was 50 years old with close-cropped natural hair and the measured movements of someone who had learned long ago not to waste energy on things that did not matter. She carried a yellow legal pad and a pen that she clicked twice before sitting down. Her office was small and very organized, which I respected immediately. I placed my folder on the desk between us and told her everything from the beginning. I spoke for 22 minutes without interruption. She wrote steadily throughout, clicking her pen between notes. When I finished, she read back through what she had written, asked 4 precise questions, and then picked up the copy of the transfer document from the folder. She studied the notarization stamp at the bottom. "In Thomas Redfield," she said. "I know of his office. He has been a licensed notary in Sacramento County for over 20 years. She set the document down. "Mr. Grayson, every notary in California is required by law to maintain an official sequential journal of every notarial act they perform. The journal must record the date-time type of document and the signature of every person who appears before them. It is a permanent legal record. And if the journal shows no entry for this transaction," I asked. "Then this document was not legally notarized," she said, "which means it cannot be used as valid evidence of a property transfer under California law." She picked up her phone and made a call. I sat quietly while she spoke professional, direct, requesting records access through the appropriate legal channels. She was on the phone for 6 minutes. When she hung up, she made a note on her legal pad and looked at me. His office will make the journal available for inspection, she said. We can review the relevant entries this afternoon. We arrived at Thomas Redfield's office on Watt Avenue at 2 o'clock. Redfield himself was a quiet man in his late 60s who met us in the reception area and led us to a back room where he kept his bound journals in chronological order onto shelf. He located the volume covering the relevant period and placed it on the table without comment, then stepped out and closed the door. Margaret opened the journal to May of 2022. She found the 12th immediately. There were 3 entries for May 11th. There were 2 entries for May 13th. For May 12th, the page was blank, except for a single handwritten notation in the margin in different ink than the surrounding entries made after the fact. Margaret read it aloud. Office closed. Power outage. Elk Grove grid section. Full day. No transactions conducted. She looked at me across the journal. I looked at the blank page where an entry for May 12th should have been and was not. There is no record, I said. There is no record, she confirmed. This office was closed the entire day of May 12th, 2022. No notarial act could have been performed here under any circumstances. The document your son submitted to the court was stamped with a notarization that is physically impossible according to this journal. I sat back in my chair. Outside on Watt Avenue, traffic moved in the afternoon heat. Through the window, I could see a line of eucalyptus trees along the sidewalk, their bark peeling in long, pale strips. Margaret closed the journal carefully. We need one more piece, she said. The hospital records, I said. Yes, if we can establish both that the notarization could not have occurred and that you were medically incapacitated on the same date the document collapses entirely as evidence. I already had the records. I had requested them from Mercy General Hospital the week before, paid the processing fee, and received a sealed envelope that I had carried in my folder since. I opened it now and spread the pages on the table. Margaret read through the admission record, the ICU intake form, the nursing notes from May 12th. She stopped at a page near the middle and tapped it once with her pen. Donna Pruitt, she said, reading the attending nurse's name from the record. She was the charge nurse on duty during your admission. Is her signature sufficient? I asked. Her contemporaneous nursing notes are already sufficient, Margaret said. But if she is willing to provide a written statement confirming the clinical record that removes any remaining ambiguity. She looked at me steadily. Mr. Grayson, I want to be careful about what I tell you at this stage. What we have found today is significant, but the strength of evidence is not the same as a guaranteed outcome. Courts weigh everything. I understand that, I said. Good. She gathered the documents and stacked them neatly. Because the next step is harder than finding the truth. The next step is proving it in a room where the other side has had more time to prepare than you have. She walked me to the elevator when we finished. As the doors opened, she looked at me and said, You built that house yourself, Mr. Grayson. Every board, I said. She nodded once. Then you know that the foundation is what holds everything else up. Marcus Webb called my cell phone the following morning at 9:43. I had given my number to Margaret Osie's office as my primary contact, and she had passed it along to Webb's attorney with my permission, after he had reached out to legal aid the previous week, asking about the property at Ridgewood Lane. His attorney had called first to confirm I was willing to meet. I was. We met at a coffee shop on Bruceville Road in Elk Grove, a quiet place with wooden tables and good light. Webb was 47 years old, broad-shouldered, with the careful handshake of a man who had learned to measure people quickly. He wore a collared shirt and carried a leather portfolio that he set on the table between us without opening it immediately. He ordered black coffee. I ordered the same. Mr. Grayson, he said, I want to be direct with you. I believe I have been defrauded, and I believe the person who defrauded me used your property to do it. Tell me how it happened, I said. He opened the portfolio. Inside were printed emails, a signed letter of intent, a wire transfer confirmation, and a copy of a document he described as a preliminary purchase agreement. He spread them on the table in the order they had occurred. Sabrina had contacted him in November of the previous year through a professional real estate network. She had presented herself as the authorized listing agent for a residential property in Elk Grove. She described the property accurately: the lot size, the construction, the age of the house, the mature oak tree in the front yard. She told him the property was being transferred within the family and would be available for purchase following the completion of that process, which she described as routine and nearly finalized. Webb had done his due diligence. He had driven past the property, reviewed comparable sales in the area, and consulted with his own attorney. The property was accurately described. The price was fair. The seller's representation seemed professional. He had wired $380,000 as a deposit in January, with the balance to follow upon completion of the transfer. He had heard nothing from Sabrina since March. I tried calling, he said. The number she gave me went to voicemail. Her email responses became short and then stopped. My attorney sent a formal letter in May. No response. He looked at me steadily across the coffee cups. She had no authority to sell that property, did she? None, I said. He pressed his lips together and looked down at the documents for a moment. His right hand rested flat on the table, and I noticed his fingers were very still, the deliberate stillness of a man controlling something. I am not angry at you, Mr. Grayson, he said. I want you to know that. You are not responsible for what she did. I know, I said. But I am sorry it happened. He nodded. He closed the portfolio and sat back in his chair. My attorney tells me I have a civil claim against Sabrina Grayson personally for the return of the deposit plus damages. That is a separate matter, and we will pursue it separately. He paused. But I understand you may need documentation of this transaction for your own court proceedings. It would help establish that the property was being marketed for sale before any legal transfer had occurred, I said. Which contradicts the position that the transfer document was a routine family arrangement. Webb reached into the portfolio and produced a separate folder. He slid it across the table. Copies of everything, he said. Signed statement from me describing the full sequence of events. My attorney's contact information is on the cover page. We will cooperate with whatever process you need us for. I picked up the folder and held it for a moment. 38 years ago, I had poured the concrete foundation of the house on Ridgewood Lane myself, mixing it in a rented drum and wheeling it in a barrow across uneven ground. I had worked alone on the foundation for 4 weekends, checking the level after every pour, because a foundation that was off by even a fraction of an inch would create problems in every wall that stood on top of it. Helen had brought sandwiches and sat on the hood of the car and read to me from whatever book she was working through that month. I had built that house to last. Webb walked me to my car when we finished. He was quiet for a moment before I got in, looking at the middle distance the way people do when they are deciding whether to say something they have been thinking about. Mr. Grayson, he said finally, I have been in real estate for 20 years. I have seen a lot of family property disputes. He paused. I have never seen someone sell a house that was not theirs to sell with that kind of confidence. She believed she would not get caught. I looked at him. She almost was not, I said. He shook my hand and walked back to his own car. I sat in mine for a moment with the folder on the passenger seat. Then my phone buzzed on the dashboard. Derek's number, I answered. His voice was low and tight, all pretense completely stripped away. "I know you met with Webb today, Dad." "Yes," I said. "You need to stop." His breath came through the line unsteady, the breath of a man who had been holding something at bay for a long time. "If this goes where you are taking it, there are consequences that cannot be undone. For me. For Sabrina." "Is that what you want?" I looked through the windshield at the oak trees lining Bruceville Road. Their leaves were full now, deep summer green moving in the warm July air. "What I want," I said, "has not changed since the first day you came home with your luggage. I want my house. I want the life your mother and I built to mean something. That is all I have ever wanted." I ended the call and sat in the quiet car. The folder was on the passenger seat. My notebook was in my jacket pocket. The foundation, Margaret had said, was what held everything else up. I started the engine and drove back toward Ridgewood Lane. I drove to Ridgewood Lane at 5:45 the following morning. The street was quiet at that hour. A sprinkler ran in the yard, 2 houses down. The oak tree in front of my house stood dark against the pale sky, its branches still. I parked at the curb rather than the driveway and walked around the side of the house to the workshop entrance using the key I had kept on my ring since the day I installed the lock in 1989. The side gate hinges needed oil. I made a note of it out of habit, the way an engineer notes things that require attention, even when everything else is falling apart. The workshop smelled exactly as it had always smelled. Sawdust and linseed oil and the particular dry wood smell that accumulates over decades and becomes indistinguishable from the building itself. The workbench ran along the north wall beneath the pegboard, where my hand tools hung in the outlines I had traced in marker, so every tool had a place, and an absence was immediately visible. Helen had laughed at that system when I built it. She said I treated my chisels better than most men treated their families. She was not entirely wrong. I did not turn on the overhead light. The gray morning light coming through the single east-facing window was enough for what I needed to do. I moved to the far corner of the workshop to the section of flooring I had laid myself over a shallow storage space I had built when the workshop was new. 3 boards. The third one from the right lifted with a specific pressure applied 2 inches from the left end. Helen had known this, and only Helen. I lifted the board and reached into the space below. The metal box was there. It was a standard document lockbox, olive green, about the size of a shoebox, with a combination dial on the front. Helen had kept it since before we were married. I had never known the combination, and had never asked, because some things belong entirely to one person, and asking about them is a kind of trespass. But she had told me once during a quiet evening 2 months before she died that the combination was the month and day of the afternoon we met, September 14th. She had said it casually, as though mentioning it in passing, and I had understood without her saying so that she was telling me for a reason. I sat cross-legged on the workshop floor with the box in my lap and entered the combination. The lock released. Inside were several envelopes, a small photograph, and a notebook spiral-bound with a pale blue cover, the kind sold in office supply stores for $2. I picked up the notebook first. Helen's handwriting covered the first 12 pages. The entries were not dated consistently. Some had dates, some only seasons, some nothing at all. She had written in the careful, deliberate way she wrote everything, each letter formed, completely no words abbreviated. I read from the beginning. She had written about the house, about watching me build it, about the specific quality of her feeling on the day we moved in. Not happiness exactly, she wrote, but the feeling of having arrived at a place that was true. She wrote about Derek as a young child, the good years, the years when he had been exactly the son we had hoped for. She wrote about watching him change as he got older, the ambition that had sharpened over time into something harder, and her worry about what that hardening might eventually cost him. Then I reached the passage that made me stop. If our son ever loses his way, and I pray he does not, but I am a practical woman, and I have watched him long enough to know the risk. Do not let love become a reason to look away from what is wrong. Love him anyway. But do not confuse loving someone with protecting them from the truth of what they have done. You have been too gentle your whole life, Walter. I mean that as the deepest compliment I know how to give. But gentleness without limits is not a virtue. It is an invitation. I read that paragraph 3 times. Outside, a car moved down Ridgewood Lane. The sprinkler had stopped. The workshop was warming slightly as the sun rose. I turned the next page. The house is yours. It was always yours. I signed the deed with you, and I meant every word of it. Whatever happens after I am gone, whatever pressure comes, whatever argument is made, remember that I am the other name on that document, and I am telling you, do not let it go. Not for guilt, not for pity, not for peace. The peace you buy by surrendering what is true is not peace. It is just a quieter kind of loss. I closed the notebook. I sat in the workshop for a long time without moving. The morning light had shifted, and now came in at a lower angle across the workbench, catching the dust in the air, and making it visible all the small suspended particles that were always there, but could only be seen in the right light. At the bottom of the box, beneath the envelopes, was a small object I had not noticed at first, a USB drive, small and black, with a strip of white tape on one side. Written on the tape in Helen's handwriting were 4 characters. 1985. I held it in my palm and looked at it. Helen had not been comfortable with computers. She printed emails and wrote grocery lists by hand, and asked me to program every new phone she owned. She would not have put something on a USB drive without a specific reason and a specific intention about who would find it and when. Helen had asked her nephew Thomas to help her transfer the old VHS tapes to digital the summer before she was diagnosed. She had said she wanted the memories kept safely. She had known even then that some things needed to outlast the format they were born in. I closed the box and replaced it in the floor storage. I put the notebook in my jacket pocket and the USB drive beside it. Then I replaced the board, applied pressure 2 inches from the left end, and heard it lock back into place. I stood up and looked around the workshop one more time. Then I walked back to my car in the early morning light, started the engine, and drove to the Comfort Inn on Laguna Boulevard, where my laptop was sitting on the desk by the window. I sat at the desk by the window of my motel room and held the USB drive for a long time before I plugged it in. The morning light came through the gap in the curtains and lay across the desk in a thin bar. Outside on Laguna Boulevard, traffic was building, the ordinary Tuesday morning sounds of a city going about its business, trucks and commuters, and the distant signal of a crossing guard's whistle from the elementary school 2 blocks north. I was aware of all of it in the peripheral way you are aware of weather, present noted irrelevant. I plugged the drive into my laptop. A single folder appeared. Inside the folder was one file. The file was labeled with Helen's characteristic precision. Not a date, not a title, just 2 words, for Walter. I opened it. The video took 4 seconds to load. When it began, the quality was what I expected from footage transferred from an old VHS cassette. Slightly washed out, the colors, warm and imprecise, the edges of the frame soft. There was a brief moment of static. Then the image resolved into something I recognized immediately and completely. My front yard. 1985. The house was not yet finished. The exterior siding was up but unpainted, the front porch railing not yet installed. The yard still mostly bare dirt, with a few patches of new grass seed coming in along the edges. The oak tree was a sapling barely taller than the fence post beside it, its trunk no wider than my wrist. The camera was stationary, propped on something at approximately chest height. I could see from the angle that it was pointed toward the right side of the house, where I had been working on the framing for the side entrance. I watched myself walk into the frame, 30 years old, wearing a white undershirt, dark with sweatwork jeans with the knees worn through steel-toed boots, carrying a 2x6 across one shoulder with the ease of a man who had been carrying lumber for 3 years. I set it down against the wall, pulled a pencil from behind my ear, and made a mark. Then a sound came from off-camera, small and high and urgent. "Dad! Dad! Dad!" I heard my own voice younger call back, "Workshop's around the side, buddy, come around." The small figure that came running around the corner of the house was Derek at 8 years old. He was wearing a striped shirt and sneakers, and he was carrying with both hands and great seriousness a child's hammer, the red-handled kind sold at hardware stores for $5, with a head the size of a large walnut. He ran across the dirt yard with the particular full-body commitment of a child, for whom running is still a complete activity in itself. He stopped in front of the camera without knowing it was there, looked up at me and held out the hammer. "Can I help?" he said. "I want to build too." The man in the video, the man I had been crouched down to eye level and looked at his son for a moment. Then he said, "You want to drive a nail?" Derek's entire face opened. "Yes. Come here, buddy." I watched myself find a spare piece of scrap lumber and prop it against the sawhorse. I watched myself show Derek where to position the nail, how to hold the hammer, how to look at the head, not the handle. I watched Derek's face as he concentrated the particular ferocious concentration of a child doing something for the first time that he understands to be real. He swung. The hammer glanced off the nail head and struck the wood at an angle, and Derek stumbled sideways with the force of the miss and sat down hard in the dirt and looked up at me with an expression that could not decide between laughter and embarrassment. He chose laughter. I watched him laugh the uninhibited full-body laughter of an 8-year-old boy sitting in the dirt of his own front yard in the summer of 1985. And I felt something move through my chest that I could not have named precisely. It was not grief exactly. It was not nostalgia. It was something closer to the feeling of holding a true measurement, the recognition of something that had once been exactly right. Then Derek scrambled back to his feet, picked up the hammer, and looked directly into the camera lens, not knowing it was recording. Not performing for anyone, just a boy looking in a direction, and said with complete conviction, "When I grow up, I'm gonna protect this house with you, Dad." The video ended. 41 seconds of footage. Pale summer light. A boy and his father and a red-handled hammer and an oak tree the width of a wrist. I sat at the desk and did not move for a long time. The bar of morning light had shifted across the desk as the sun moved. Outside, the school crossing guard's whistle had gone quiet. The traffic on Laguna Boulevard continued its ordinary passage. I thought about the 8-year-old boy in that video. I thought about the 44-year-old man in the courtroom. I thought about the distance between those two people and what had been lost in the crossing, and whether any of it could be recovered, and whether that was even the right question to ask. Then I picked up my phone and called Margaret Osei. She answered on the second ring. "Margaret," I said, "I have one more thing for the court. Something I think they need to see." A pause. Then, "Bring it in tomorrow morning, Mr. Grayson. First thing." I set the phone down. I looked at the USB drive sitting beside the laptop. 41 seconds. The oak tree no wider than my wrist, and a boy who had once meant every word he said. I put the drive carefully in the inside pocket of my jacket directly over my heart, and sat in the quiet room until it was time to go. Before I reveal what happened when the final evidence hit the courtroom table, if you're listening here on Dad's Revenge Stories, type 1985 or Justice in the comments, so I know you're still with me. And please note, the following part of the story contains dramatized narrative elements crafted for storytelling. If this isn't what you're looking for today, feel free to close the video right here. Otherwise, stay tuned for the final truth. The second hearing was assigned to Judge Raymond Caldwell, a man in his early 60s with a reputation, Margaret told me, for running a tight courtroom and tolerating no procedural shortcuts from either side. That suited me fine. I had not come to this hearing looking for shortcuts. I arrived at the Sacramento County Superior Court on Gordon D. Shaber Drive at 8:40 on a Thursday morning in August. Margaret met me in the lobby. She was carrying 2 folders and a trial bag, and had the focused expression of a person who had done her preparation and was ready to work. She looked at my jacket, at the folder under my arm, and nodded once. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Ready?" I said. We walked through the security checkpoint together and took the elevator to the 3rd floor. The courtroom was larger than the one from the first hearing, higher ceilings, more gallery rows, windows along the east wall that let in the morning light at a low angle. I noted these things the way I noted structural details on any building I entered, out of a habit 40 years in the making. Gerald Foss was already at the opposing table. He had added a second attorney, a younger woman in a gray suit, who was arranging exhibits with the careful efficiency of someone who understood that organization was its own form of argument. Derek sat beside Foss in a dark jacket. He was looking at the table when I walked in. Sabrina was not in the courtroom. I noted that too. Margaret and I took our seats. She opened her first folder and reviewed her notes without speaking. I placed my own folder on the table and rested both hands flat on the surface and looked at the empty bench and breathed. Judge Caldwell entered at 9:30 exactly. Everyone stood. He settled into his chair, opened the case file, and spent 90 seconds reading. Then he looked up. "We are here on a petition for conservatorship of the estate of Walter Raymond Grayson, filed by Derek Allen Grayson." He looked at both tables. "I have reviewed the prior proceedings and the recusal of Judge Holman. I have also reviewed the preliminary submissions from both parties." He set down his glasses. "Mr. Foss, you may present your case." Foss stood and spoke for 18 minutes. He was good, I will give him that. He presented the conservatorship argument methodically. Walter's age, his solitary living situation, the scale of the property, Derek's concern for his father's welfare. He submitted the video clip of me at the restaurant, my hand trembling slightly around a water glass. He submitted the neighborhood petition with Carol Finch's signature. He submitted the transfer document with my supposed signature dated May 12, 2022. He described these as evidence of a family acting responsibly in difficult circumstances. Then he sat down and looked at our table with the measured confidence of a man who believed the morning was already decided. Margaret stood. She spoke for 26 minutes. She submitted my complete medical records from Mercy General Hospital covering May 12, 2022. The ICU admission, the nursing notes in Donna Pruitt's handwriting, the attending physician's report, confirming I had been unconscious and medically incapacitated for 18 hours. She submitted Thomas Redfield's notary journal, showing his office had been closed the entire day due to a power outage. She submitted Marcus Webb's signed statement describing Sabrina's unauthorized solicitation of a $380,000 deposit on a property she had no legal authority to sell. She submitted Frank Delano's written account of Derek's February visit and the text message Derek had sent requesting a false witness statement. With each submission, Foss's second attorney wrote something on her legal pad. With each submission, Foss himself became incrementally, almost imperceptibly, more still. Then Margaret said, "Your Honor, we have one final exhibit." She removed the USB drive from her folder and handed it to the court clerk, who connected it to the courtroom's display system. The large screen on the east wall of the courtroom came to life. I did not look at the screen. I looked at Derek. He had been watching the table since Foss sat down. But when the courtroom lights dimmed slightly and the screen brightened, he looked up. He saw the image before the video began, the still frame of my front yard in 1985. The unfinished house, the dirt yard, the sapling oak no wider than a wrist. His jaw moved. Margaret addressed the court. "Your Honor, this footage was transferred from an original VHS recording made in 1985 at the family home at Ridgewood Lane in Elk Grove. It was preserved by Helen Grayson, the petitioner's mother, and recovered by Walter Grayson from the family property last week." She clicked play. The sound came first. The slight hiss of old magnetic tape, then whined, then the distant noise of a neighborhood summer morning 40 years ago. Then the image began to move, and the courtroom went completely quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something real enters them. I kept my eyes on Derek. His hands, which had been folded on the table, separated. His right hand moved to the table's edge and gripped it. On the screen behind me, I could hear my own voice 30 years younger. "Come here, buddy." And then a child's laughter, full and unguarded, the laughter of a boy who had just fallen in the dirt and chosen joy over embarrassment. And then the boy's voice, clear and certain and 8 years old. "When I grow up, I'm gonna protect this house with you, Dad." The video ran for 41 seconds. When it ended, the courtroom remained silent. Not the polite silence of people waiting for the next procedural step, but the particular silence of a room where something true has just been said, and everyone present understands that responding too quickly would be a kind of dishonesty. I had not watched the screen while it played. I had watched Derek. I had seen his right hand move from the table's surface to its edge and grip it. I had seen his jaw work once and then go still. I had seen something move through his face that was not performance and not calculation, something older and less manageable than either of those things. When the boy's voice came through the courtroom, speakers clear and certain and 8 years old, "When I grow up, I'm gonna protect this house with you." Dad Derek had closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then he had opened them and looked at nothing in particular, which is what people do when they are looking at something that exists only inside themselves. The screen went dark. The room breathed again slowly, the way rooms breathe when the weight in them has shifted, but not yet lifted. Judge Caldwell looked at the now dark screen for a moment. Then he looked at Gerald Foss. "Mr. Foss, do you wish to respond to this exhibit?" Foss stood. He was still composed, the professional composure of a man who had survived difficult courtrooms before. But something in his argument had shifted the way a structure shifts when a load-bearing element is removed. He questioned the chain of custody of the recording. He questioned its relevance to the conservatorship petition. He spoke for 4 minutes and used many words and said very little that the room had not already understood was insufficient. I watched Foss the way I used to watch subcontractors who were explaining why something had gone wrong on a job site. There is a particular quality to that kind of speech, fluent, professional, technically correct in its individual components, and fundamentally evasive in its overall direction. Foss was very good at it. But Judge Caldwell had been listening to that kind of speech for 30 years from both sides of the aisle, and his expression did not change once during the 4 minutes. When Foss sat down, the judge looked at Derek directly. "Mr. Derek Grayson," he said, "you are the petitioner in this matter. I am going to ask you a direct question, and I expect a direct answer. Do you dispute that the voices in this recording belong to you and your father?" Gerald Foss put his hand on Derek's arm immediately. Derek looked at his attorney. Something passed between them that I could see from across the room, a rapid private negotiation conducted entirely in glances, and then Derek shook his head once slowly, and Foss removed his hand from his arm. "No," Derek said. "I don't dispute it." "Do you dispute that the conversation occurred?" Derek's jaw worked. He looked at the table. "No." Judge Caldwell wrote something on his notepad. The courtroom held its breath. I held mine. 40 years of engineering had taught me that the moment before a structure either holds or fails is always quieter than you expect. The material does not announce what it is about to do. It simply does it, and the sound comes after. Sitting in that courtroom, I understood that I was inside that moment, the quiet one before the sound. Then the judge looked at the transfer document, the one with my supposed signature dated May 12, 2022, and set it aside with a deliberateness that communicated more than any ruling language could have. "The court finds," he said, "that the document submitted as evidence of voluntary property transfer is inconsistent with the medical records entered into evidence and inconsistent with the official records of the notary whose certification appears on the document. The court further finds that the petition for conservatorship is not supported by credible evidence of incapacity. The petition is denied." He looked at both tables. "The matter of potential document fraud will be referred to the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office for independent review." Foss stood immediately. "Your Honor, my client has the right to consult with criminal defense counsel," Judge Caldwell said evenly. "That is a separate proceeding, and it will be addressed separately. This court's business today is concluded." He gathered his papers. I stood up. The room was still arranged around me, the gallery, the clerk's desk, the flags on either side of the bench, the east-facing windows with the August light coming through at a low angle. All of it exactly as it had been when I walked in that morning. But the weight of the room had redistributed itself in the past 90 minutes, and I felt the difference the way you feel. The difference after a fever breaks, not dramatic, not triumphant, just a return to the temperature that was always supposed to be there. "Your Honor?" My voice came out steady, which surprised me slightly because my hands were not entirely steady beneath the table. "Before the court adjourns, I would like to state for the record that I do not intend to pursue any civil damages claim arising from this matter. I also want it known that I will not be volunteering a supporting statement to the district attorney's office. Whatever process follows will proceed on its own terms without my active participation in building a case against my son." Judge Caldwell looked at me over his glasses. "Mr. Grayson, you understand that a referral to the DA's office proceeds independently of your preferences." "I understand that, Your Honor. I am not asking the court to prevent anything. I am simply stating my own position." I paused. My son made serious mistakes. The record reflects that clearly. But I am 72 years old, and I have one son, and I will not be the instrument of his destruction. Whatever accountability comes to him, I would prefer it come through the natural weight of what he has done, rather than through my active participation in his prosecution. The courtroom was very quiet. To my left, I was aware of Margaret beside me, still professional, her yellow legal pad closed on the table. To my right across the aisle, I was aware of Gerald Foss with his hand resting on his closed briefcase, and Derek beside him, not looking at Foss, not looking at the table, not looking at anything that was helping him. Judge Caldwell held my gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once, not an endorsement, not a judgment, simply the acknowledgement of one person recognizing another person's considered decision, and closed his file. "Court is adjourned," he said. Everyone stood. I stood still while the room moved around me. Margaret put her hand briefly on my arm and said something I did not fully hear. Gerald Foss closed his briefcase quickly and spoke in a low, urgent tone to Derek, who was not listening. Derek was looking at me across the courtroom directly, without the deflection of the past several months, without the performance of confidence or the armor of indifference. Just looking. The way a person looks when all the other options have been exhausted. I looked back. I thought about the boy in the video. 8 years old, striped shirt, red hammer, full-body laughter in the dirt of the front yard. I thought about the gap between that boy and the man standing across the courtroom from me, now not the distance of years, which was just arithmetic, but the distance of choices, which was something else entirely, something that could not be measured in any unit I had ever been trained to use. Margaret guided me toward the door. In the corridor outside, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and a group of people with a different case file waited on the bench beside the elevator. Ordinary courthouse life proceeding around the edges of things that felt from inside them enormous. I heard footsteps behind me. "Dad?" I stopped walking. Margaret glanced at me and then stepped away quietly, giving us the corridor. Derek was standing 6 feet behind me. He was not wearing his courtroom expression anymore. His jacket seemed to fit differently, not looser, but as though the body inside it had changed shape in the past hour. His eyes were red at the edges, in the way that eyes get red when a person has been holding something back for a long time, and the holding is no longer possible. He did not say anything else immediately. He stood there in the courthouse corridor with the fluorescent lights making everything equally pale, and waited. I turned to face my son. He was 44 years old. He had his mother's forehead and my hands and a set of mistakes that were entirely his own. He had been the boy with the red hammer in the summer of 1985, and he had also been the man across the mahogany table in the mediation office. And he was also this, a person standing in a hallway, having run out of road. "I don't know how to start," he said finally. His voice was rough, the way voices get rough when the throat has been tight for hours. Then don't start anywhere complicated," I said. "Just start with what's true." He pressed his lips together. His chin dropped slightly. When he looked back up, his eyes were wet. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said. "I'm sorry for all of it." I looked at my son for a long moment. Outside the courthouse windows, Sacramento was going about its Thursday. Traffic on Gordon D. Schauber Drive. A delivery truck double-parked at the corner. 2 pigeons working the steps below. The city indifferent and ongoing and entirely unaware that something had just been said in this corridor that would take years to fully mean what it meant. "I know one," I said. We found an empty conference room on the 2nd floor of the courthouse. Margaret had pointed it out, as she left a small room with a glass door and a rectangular table and 4 chairs used between hearings for attorney consultations. She had looked at me, and then at Derek, and then back at me without saying anything, and I had nodded, and she had gone to wait in the lobby. The room was vacant and unlocked. We went in and closed the door, and sat across from each other at the small table the way we had sat across from each other at my kitchen table 6 months ago. Except that everything between then and now had stripped away every pretense we had both been maintaining for longer than either of us probably understood. Derek sat with his hands in his lap. His jacket was off, now folded over the back of his chair. His shirt was slightly rumpled from the morning. He looked like a man who had been very tired for a very long time, and had finally stopped pretending otherwise. I looked at my son and waited. "I don't know how to explain it," he said. "I've been trying to find the right words since I walked out of that courtroom, and I don't have them." "Then don't look for the right words," I said. "Just tell me what happened." He exhaled slowly. "The business started falling apart about 3 years ago. A development deal in Rancho Cordova that I had staked everything on. The financing collapsed. The partners walked, and I was left holding contracts I couldn't fulfill. By the time I understood how bad it was, I owed $2.3 million to people who were not interested in payment plans. "You didn't come to me," I said. "No." "Why?" He pressed his hands flat on the table. "Because I was 41 years old, and I had spent 20 years telling myself I didn't need your help anymore, that I had built something on my own. Coming to you with $2.3 million in debt felt like—" He stopped, started again. It felt like admitting that everything I had been was a performance. I sat with that for a moment. Outside the glass door, a court officer walked past the corridor without looking in. The building went about its business around us. "And Sabrina?" I asked. Derek's jaw tightened. The plan was hers initially. I want to be honest about that. She came to me with the numbers, what the house was worth, what it would clear after everything. She said your remaining years would be more comfortable in a facility, that you would be looked after properly, that this was the logical solution. He paused. And I listened to her because I wanted to believe there was a version of this where I wasn't doing something wrong. "But you knew," I said. He did not look away. "Yes, I knew." That honesty cost him something. I could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the way his hands pressed harder against the table as the words left him. I did not make it easier. He had earned the weight of saying it plainly. "The document," I said. "The transfer agreement." Derek closed his eyes briefly. "Sabrina handled that. She found someone through a business contact who could prepare paperwork." I did not ask the specific questions I should have asked, because asking them would have forced me to confront what I already suspected. His voice dropped. "That is not an excuse. It is just what happened." "And the date," I said. "May 12th, 2022. He opened his eyes. "I didn't know you were in the hospital that day. I found out after. When I realized what date had been used, He stopped. "You said nothing," I said. "I said nothing," he confirmed. The words came out flat and without defense, which was the only way they could honestly be said. I stood up from the table and walked to the window. The courthouse faced east, and the morning light had shifted now, coming in fuller and more direct than it had at the start of the hearing. Below on Gordon D. Shaber Drive, a city bus was pulling away from the stop. Two pigeons worked the sidewalk near the entrance. I thought about 1998. I thought about the phone call and the truck and the check. I thought about how I had never once used that moment as leverage, never once let Derek feel the weight of it as a debt, because I had genuinely believed, that a father's sacrifice should be invisible. That love expressed as sacrifice and then held over someone was not love, but a transaction dressed in softer language. I wondered now whether my invisibility had been a kindness or a failure. Whether Derek had grown up understanding that some things cost everything precisely because they were worth everything, or whether he had grown up understanding only that cost, when it came, would be absorbed by someone else. I turned back from the window. "When your mother was sick," I said, "she wrote in her notebook that I had been too gentle my whole life. That gentleness without limits is an invitation." I paused. "I think she was right. I think I made it very easy for you to believe that I would absorb whatever came, that there would always be a cushion between you and the full weight of your choices." Derek's throat moved. "Dad, I am not saying this to punish you," I said. "I am saying it because it is true and because you are my son, and I would rather tell you a hard truth than a comfortable lie. I came back to the table and sat down. You are 44 years old. You have made serious mistakes. Some of those mistakes will have consequences that I cannot and should not protect you from. But you are still my son. And I am not finished being your father. He was crying now. Not dramatically. Not the way people cry in performances, but in the quiet, involuntary way that happens when a person has been holding something for months and the structure finally gives. His shoulders shook once, twice, and then steadied. He pressed the back of his hand against his eyes. I don't deserve that, he said. No, I said. You don't. But that is not how it works between a father and a son. I told you that once before, a long time ago, and I meant it then, and I mean it now. He looked at me across the table. His face was open in a way I had not seen since he was very young, since the summer of 1985 perhaps, since a boy with a red hammer sat in the dirt of his own front yard and chose laughter. What happens now? He asked. Now, I said, you go deal with the consequences of what you have done. You cooperate with whatever legal process comes. You make it right with Marcus Webb. You figure out your debts without using my house to solve them. I folded my hands on the table. And when you have done those things, when you have stood on your own feet and carried your own weight, you come home for dinner. Not to negotiate, not to manage me. Just to eat at your father's table. Derek pressed his lips together tightly. He nodded. I stood up and picked up my folder from the chair. One more thing, I said. He looked up. Sabrina took your mother's cardigan off its hook and put it in a box in the garage. When you go home today, wherever home is now, I want you to think about what kind of man does that and what kind of man you intend to be going forward. I opened the glass door and walked out into the corridor. I moved back into the house on Ridgewood Lane on the last Friday of August. Derek and Sabrina had vacated 3 days after the hearing. I did not ask where they went, and Derek did not volunteer the information. He had sent me a text message, short, factual, no performance, saying the house was clear and the keys were on the kitchen counter where they had always been. I read the message twice, noted that it contained no excuses and no requests, and drove to Elk Grove the following morning. The house smelled different when I opened the front door. Not bad, just unfamiliar the way a room smells when the people in it have been replaced by different people. I set my bag down in the entryway and stood for a moment and let the building settle around me. The floors creaked in the places they had always creaked. The kitchen faucet had its familiar quarter-turn delay before the water ran warm. The workshop key still fit the side gate lock, even though the hinges still needed oil. I oiled the hinges that afternoon. It took 4 minutes. I had been meaning to do it since March. Helen's cardigan was still on the hook beside the closet door in the bedroom. Her photograph was on the wall above the dresser. Her blue coffee mug was where I had always kept it. The morning light found it the way it always had. I had put everything back myself after Sabrina's people had cleared the room, and it had stayed where I put it. I made coffee and stood in the kitchen and drank it and listened to the house. The letter from Judge Patricia Holman arrived on a Tuesday morning in the second week of September. It came in a standard white envelope with no return address. Just my name and address in careful, unrushed handwriting. The kind of handwriting that belongs to a person who writes letters by hand because they understand that some things should not be communicated any faster than ink can carry them. I sat at the kitchen table and opened it. She wrote 4 paragraphs. I will not reproduce them word for word because they were written for me and they belong to me. But I will say what they contained. She wrote about the night on Route 50. She described what she remembered, the rain, the sound of her own breathing in the collapsed car, the broken window, and then a voice that came through the dark and the noise and said, "I'm not leaving." She wrote that she had spent 15 years wondering whether she would ever encounter the person that voice belonged to, and that when she had looked up from the case file and seen my face across the courtroom, she had understood immediately and completely. She wrote that she had recused herself, not because she doubted her own impartiality, but because she refused to give either side any reason to question the integrity of the outcome. She wanted whatever happened in that courtroom to be unassailable. She wanted the truth to win on its own terms, without any shadow of personal connection to complicate it. And then she wrote the sentence I have read more times than I can count since that September morning. "You stayed with me in the rain because it was right, not because anyone was watching, not because there was anything to gain. That is the rarest kind of character I know, Mr. Grayson, and I want you to know that it was not wasted. It never is." I folded the letter and placed it in the front cover of Helen's blue notebook, which I had put on the kitchen shelf beside her coffee mug. 2 things she had left me. One written before she died, one written by a stranger whose life she never knew had intersected with mine on a wet highway 15 years ago. Together, they said the same thing from different directions in different voices. Do what is right. The rest takes care of itself. Frank came over that evening. He brought a thermos of coffee and 2 sandwiches from the deli on Grant Line Road, and we sat on the front porch in the wooden chairs I had built in 1987. The oak tree cast a long shadow across the front walk in the early September light. The raised root that I kept meaning to fix was still there, lifting the corner of the walkway at its familiar angle. I told Frank about the letter. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about Frank that had never changed in 35 years. When I finished, he poured coffee from the thermos into both cups and handed one to me and looked out at the oak tree for a moment. "Helen would have liked her," he said. "She would have invited her to dinner," I said, "and made her stay for dessert." Frank smiled. It was the first time in several months that smiling felt like the natural shape of the moment rather than something that required effort. 3 weeks later, I called Margaret Osei and told her I wanted to begin the process of amending my will. She came to the house on a Wednesday afternoon, and we sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Derek had placed the cream envelope with the senior living deposit, the same table where I had unfolded the property listing with Marcus Webb's name on it, and I told her what I wanted to do. The house at Ridgewood Lane upon my death would be donated in its entirety to a nonprofit organization providing permanent supportive housing for elderly residents without family support in Sacramento County. The workshop would remain available to me for the duration of my life. A small endowment from my retirement savings would cover maintenance costs for the first decade after my death. Margaret wrote everything down carefully. When I finished, she looked up. "This is a significant gift, Mr. Grayson." "It is a significant house," I said. "It should go somewhere significant." She left at 4 o'clock. I walked her to her car and then stood in the driveway for a moment, looking at the front of the house in the afternoon light. The paint was holding. The porch boards needed refinishing. I had noted that in my maintenance log and scheduled it for October. The oak tree was enormous now, its canopy spreading over the roof edge on the north side, its roots working patiently at the walkway corner. I looked at the porch light. I had installed it in 1986, the year after we moved in. A simple fixture, brushed brass, the kind that takes a standard bulb and does nothing complicated. Helen had asked for it specifically. She said she wanted anyone coming home in the dark to be able to see the door. I had wired it myself on a Saturday afternoon while she read on the porch steps and handed me tools when I asked for them. I turned it on even though it was still afternoon and the sun was nowhere near setting. I stood there and looked at it, burning in the daylight, a small warm point of light doing its simple work in the middle of a bright day. and I thought about everything it had looked at over the past 40 years. Derek coming home from high school. Helen sitting under it on summer evenings with her book. Me returning from job sites in the late dark, seeing it from the end of the street and knowing I was nearly home. I thought about what a house is, not the lumber and the concrete and the 40 years of maintenance logs, not the assessed value that Sabrina had printed on a listing sheet or the number that Derek had needed to make his debts disappear. A house is the accumulated weight of the people who lived honestly inside it. The arguments and the dinners and the ordinary Tuesdays and the extraordinary grief and the quiet mornings when nothing particular happened. But the light came through the window at the right angle, and for a moment everything felt exactly as it should be. Helen had understood this. She had written it in her notebook in the careful handwriting of a practical woman who wanted to make sure the truth survived her. I went inside and made dinner. I ate at the kitchen table with the back door open to the evening air. The oak tree moved in the breeze outside the window. Somewhere down Ridgewood Lane, a dog was barking at something, and a neighbor's sprinkler was running, and the ordinary sounds of a neighborhood evening came through the screen door and filled the kitchen the way they had filled it for 4 decades. When I finished eating, I washed my dishes and put them away and turned off the kitchen light. The porch light stayed on. If there is one thing this family story has taught me, it is this: the things we build with love do not belong to us alone. They belong to everyone who ever sat beside us, believed in us, and stayed. I am not a perfect father. I was too gentle for too long, and my silence taught my son that consequences could always be absorbed by someone else. Do not make my mistake. If you love someone, tell them the truth early, clearly, and without waiting for a courtroom to say it for you. I believe God puts certain people in our path at the right moment. A judge who remembered a rainy night. A friend who measured twice. A wife who wrote the truth before she left. These grandpa stories are not just stories. They are mirrors. Every family story worth telling asks the same question. When everything is stripped away, who do you choose to be? This has been one man's answer. If this grandpa story reached something in you today, leave a comment below. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss the next one. Your presence here means more than you know. Thank you sincerely for staying until the end. The stories that follow contain fictional elements crafted for reflection and life lessons. If that is not what you are looking for today, no hard feelings. Choose what serves you best, and we will be here when you return.